Before the name Lucky Luciano became a whisper in back rooms and a rumor that traveled faster than truth, it belonged to a man who understood something no gangster before him ever fully grasped. Power is not loud. Power is not obvious. Power is not the gun you hold, it is the network holding you. Luciano rose in an era when the underworld believed dominance came from muscle, from bullets, from men willing to die for honor codes imported from the old world. Violence was currency, and bosses competed in displays of ferocity. Yet the young Sicilian immigrant who would one day reshape the American Mafia looked at this blood-soaked hierarchy and saw not strength but inefficiency. From the slums of the Lower East Side to the smoky bars where deals were made over glances instead of handshakes, Luciano watched everyone, friends, rivals, leaders, and realized the future did not belong to the strongest man. It belonged to the most connected one. This is the paradox of Lucky Luciano, a man born into a world of knives and vendettas who became powerful not by escalating brutality, but by reducing it. He understood that chaos consumed profit, that vendettas drained purpose, and that empires built on fear alone eventually collapse under their own brutality. So he set out, slowly and strategically, to design something new, a system that could survive beyond personalities, beyond egos, even beyond him. The invisible architecture of power. Luciano's empire was never just a network of criminals, it was a network of ideas. He constructed systems the way engineers build bridges, with structure, foresight, and an understanding of stress points. He saw the Mafia not as a clan but as a potential corporation. He viewed alliances not as conveniences but as infrastructure. Even violence, for him, was not an expression of anger. It was a calculated tool used sparingly, surgically, and only when it secured stability. While others fought to control turf, Luciano sought to control relationships. While others protected neighborhoods, he protected networks. While others ruled with fear, he ruled with structure. This book follows the rise, the revolution, and the unraveling of a man whose greatest weapon was not his fist or his gun. It was his ability to see the unseen. To understand that the real battlefield is not the street but the space between people. The alliances, the negotiations, the whispered agreements. A new kind of criminal empire. The thesis of this story is simple. Luciano did not rule the underworld. He redesigned it. And he did so by embracing three principles utterly foreign to the Mafia of his time. 1. Negotiation over tradition. He broke tribal barriers, forming alliances with Jewish and Irish gangsters when such partnerships were considered blasphemy. To Luciano, background mattered less than usefulness. 2. Structure over chaos. Where earlier bosses reacted, he planned. Where others ruled by fear, he implemented systems. His creation, the Commission, became a criminal government with policies, votes, and shared power. 3. Innovation over ego. Luciano approached crime like an industry. He streamlined operations, diversified rackets, and reduced unnecessary violence that attracted police attention and depleted profits. These principles allowed him to rise higher and faster than men twice his age and twice as ruthless. And they allowed his ideas, more than his personality, to outlive him. Fear alone was never enough. It is tempting to imagine the Mafia as a world of pure terror. But Luciano knew fear has limits. Fear may control a man for a day, structure controls him for a lifetime. Fear fractures loyalty, shared success strengthens it. Fear makes leaders paranoid, structure makes them powerful. Luciano used fear when needed, but only as reinforcement. The real foundation of his empire was cooperation, something no Mafia boss had ever seriously pursued. He turned rivals into partners, competitors into collaborators. He proved that criminal success did not require perpetual war. It required organization. The quiet revolutionary. Luciano's revolution wasn't loud. It arrived in the form of whispered agreements over tables, unexpected alliances between sworn enemies, reorganized territories that reduced conflict, and a governing body that replaced the tyrants of old. It was a revolution built in silence, a redesign of the underworld's operating system. And like all great architects, Luciano's presence became smaller as his designs became larger. The invisible web. To understand Luciano's life is to understand how invisible threads, loyalty, fear, profit, friendship, betrayal, weave an empire far more powerful than any throne. He mastered these threads, pulled them gently, tightened them gradually, and built a web so durable that parts of it still exist today. This story is not about a gangster who sought glory. It is about a strategist who sought structure. Not about violence but about vision. Not about crime but about architecture. Lucky Luciano's life reveals a truth that echoes far beyond the underworld. Revolutions are not always loud. Sometimes the world is changed by the men who speak softly and build quietly. Before Lucky Luciano rewrote the rules, the American underworld was a storm with no center, violent, unpredictable, and shaped by codes that belonged to another century. New York, swelling with immigrants and opportunity, was becoming a modern metropolis. But its criminal networks were still trapped in the shadows of the old world, governed less by strategy and more by instinct, pride, and tradition. It was a kingdom made of fragments. A mosaic of gangs, not an empire. The early 20th century underworld resembled a patchwork quilt stitched together from desperation. Italian, Irish, Jewish, Polish, and countless other ethnic gangs carved out corners of the city, each fiercely protective of its tiny domain. These groups didn't operate with synergy. They collided. Constantly. A gambling den in the wrong neighborhood could trigger a street war. A disrespectful remark could end a fragile truce. A territorial overlap could result in bodies dumped in the East River. There was no central authority, no shared vision, only isolated crews surviving day to day. Crime was not an industry. It was chaos with a pulse. The old world mafia, bound by tradition, broken by reality among the Italian factions, the situation was even messier. Most bosses had carried Sicilian or Neapolitan codes across the Atlantic like sacred scripture. In Sicily, these codes had structure. In America, they became liabilities. Honor, revenge, bloodline loyalty, these were principles meant for villages where everyone knew everyone. But New York was not a village. It was an organism growing faster than the men who tried to control it. Old world bosses insisted on rigid obedience and tribal purity, refusing to adapt to the city's complexity. They brought vendettas with them. They brought feuds older than the country they now lived in. And they brought leadership styles rooted in personal ego rather than organized strategy. The result was predictable: scattered violence. Unnecessary killings. Territories fought over like medieval fiefdoms. The Mafia wasn't an empire. It was a loose constellation of rival clans. The modernizing streets, a world outpacing its criminals while the Mafia clung to ancient codes. New York itself was undergoing a transformation. High-rise buildings pierced the skyline. Subways churned beneath the streets. Factories, ports, speakeasies, dance halls, everything operated at a pace no old-world mentality could keep up with. Prohibition accelerated this evolution. Suddenly, alcohol was illegal and the black market exploded. The demand was national. The profits unimaginable. To capitalize on this wave, criminals needed organization, efficiency, distribution networks, accountants, supply chains, the very things the Mafia refused to develop. Instead, they responded to this new world with outdated tools. Violence instead of strategy. Revenge instead of cooperation. Territorial pride instead of shared profit. The money was there. The opportunity was enormous. But the Mafia lacked the structure to seize it fully. They didn't recognize the need for innovation, not yet. The rise of rival ethnic syndicates. While Italian gangs fought their internal battles, others evolved more quickly. Jewish groups like those led by Arnold Rothstein approached crime with business acumen rather than impulse. Irish political machines had influence in city halls. These groups understood that modern crime required modern thinking. The Italians, meanwhile, continued fighting old grudges and enforcing traditions that didn't translate to American soil. The contrast was stark. Where Jewish gangs used accountants, the Mafia used knives. Where Irish politicians used influence, the Mafia used fear. Where others diversified, the Mafia clung to the past. This imbalance could not last. Two titans, one impasse. Mafia and Maranzano. As the 1920s progressed, two powerful figures rose within the Italian underworld. Joe the Boss Mafia, a crude, force-driven leader who believed loyalty was earned through terror, and Salvatore Maranzano, a Sicilian traditionalist who dreamed of imposing Roman-style order on the Mafia. Each man represented a different version of the past. Mafia embodied brute force. Maranzano embodied ancient discipline. But neither man understood the modern world they were trying to rule. Neither could grasp the scale of opportunity prohibition offered. Neither could imagine cooperation beyond bloodlines. Their rivalry, destined to become the Castellamarese War, was less about progress and more about two old-world visions colliding on American soil. A system begging for reinvention. No one inside the Mafia could articulate it, but the truth was becoming undeniable. The criminal world needed a new blueprint. Something to unify the factions. Something to streamline business. Something to prevent wars that drained profit and stability. What the underworld needed, though it didn't know it, was a strategist. Someone who could see beyond vendettas and pride. Someone who could imagine crime not as a battlefield but as an industry. The streets were evolving. The money was multiplying. The opportunities were expanding. But the Mafia had no architecture, no system, just fractured traditions choking a world that demanded innovation. And into this vacuum stepped a young visionary before Luciano's rise. The underworld was a machine missing its engineer. Its gears turned but inefficiently. Its fortunes rose but unpredictably. Its leaders fought but without purpose. The system was ripe, desperate, for reinvention. And somewhere in the Lower East Side, a young immigrant quietly watched this fractured world and understood what no one else could. Crime didn't need more warriors. It needed an architect. Before Lucky Luciano became the architect of a criminal empire, he was simply Salvatore Lucania, a small boy stepping off a ship into a world that neither knew nor welcomed him. New York's Lower East Side in the early 1900s was a hard introduction to America. A maze of overcrowded tenements, factory smoke, disease, and the restless energy of thousands of immigrants fighting for the same narrow chance at survival. The Lucania family, like so many others from Sicily, had crossed the ocean searching for opportunity. What they found instead was confinement. One cramped room, 5 people, and a daily struggle against poverty that pressed on every decision. For young Salvatore, this environment didn't merely shape him, it sharpened him. A childhood built on hard edges, the Lower East Side was alive with noise, arguments echoing through thin walls, the clatter of pushcarts, the curses of overworked laborers, and the constant hum of desperation. Children there aged faster than anywhere else in the city. School was a luxury, work was expected. And crime was visible on every corner, never hidden, never subtle. Luciano learned early that survival required more than strength. It required awareness. He watched everything: the way shopkeepers handled money, how street gangs negotiated territory, how different immigrant groups navigated prejudice. He noticed who was respected and who was ignored, who controlled the flow of goods and who benefited from it. Where most kids saw chaos, he saw patterns. Even before adolescence, Luciano possessed an instinct rare in children. He could read people. Not from their words but from their posture, hesitation, tone, and fear. It was a talent that would eventually define his leadership. The ability to sense what a man wanted, what he feared, and how he could be influenced. Discrimination. The fire that hardened him. Being an Italian immigrant in early 20th century New York meant being shoved to the margins. Italians were mocked, underpaid, and treated as second-class citizens. Doors closed before they opened. Opportunity was rationed. And society made sure children like Luciano knew exactly where they stood. But instead of accepting this position, he internalized a different lesson. If the system didn't want him, he would learn to navigate around it. If power wouldn't be offered, he would create it. Discrimination didn't break him. It gave him clarity. It taught him that rules were built for someone else's benefit, and that real success came from understanding how to bend, avoid, or rewrite them. The streets, a classroom with no mercy. By the time Luciano was 10, the streets were both school and proving ground. Gangs dominated the blocks, and boys his age were routinely pulled into petty crimes. Running errands, collecting coins, serving as lookouts. Luciano participated, but with a difference: he was studying while doing. He saw how older boys misused violence, how disputes escalated unnecessarily, how alliances broke over ego. He recognized inefficiency long before he had the language for it. His first beating at the hands of older gang members wasn't a humiliation. It was an awakening. He realized the neighborhood had a hierarchy, but it wasn't fixed. Power could shift. Leaders could fall. Weakness invited exploitation, but intelligence made a boy dangerous. After that day, Luciano didn't look for fights. He looked for relationships. The birth of a collaborator. What set Luciano apart from most street kids was not ambition alone. It was his instinct for collaboration. While ethnic groups kept to themselves, he crossed boundaries. He befriended Jewish kids, Irish kids, Sicilian kids, even those gangs considered rivals. Where others built walls, he built familiarity. His friendship with Meyer Lansky, a boy as sharp as he was, revealed a defining truth about Luciano. He didn't measure loyalty by blood. He measured it by usefulness and trust. This mindset would one day revolutionize the Mafia, but in childhood, it simply made him uniquely adaptable. While other gang leaders clung to ethnic pride, he formed alliances based on mutual gain. Luciano was learning something vital. Power grows when people believe they benefit from standing beside you. Ambition far bigger than the neighborhood. Even as a teenager, Luciano understood something most men twice his age never grasped. The streets were not the end goal, they were the entry point. He saw beyond block-by-block rivalries. He imagined networks, not corners. Systems, not skirmishes. Where others wanted money, he wanted mobility. Where others wanted recognition, he wanted influence. Ambition burned in him, but it was disciplined. He didn't brag. He didn't start wars. He didn't draw unnecessary attention. He stayed observant, calculating, fusing the old world instincts of survival with the new world promise of opportunity. The emerging power broker by his mid-teens, Luciano was already more than a street kid. He was a mediator, a strategist, the person others quietly approached to settle disputes. He understood hierarchy but was no slave to it. His decision-making was calm, controlled, almost detached. He used violence only when necessary. He preferred deals to dominance. He recognized that every conflict was a wasted opportunity. These traits, unusual in a boy his age, suggested something bigger at work: the early formation of a power broker. A young mind learning to manage people rather than intimidate them. A kid discovering that influence multiplies when you distribute it wisely. The seed of a larger vision. No one on the Lower East Side could have guessed it then, but Luciano was already incubating a radical idea: that crime didn't have to be tribal, disorganized, or driven by pride. It could be streamlined. It could be shared. It could be structured. He didn't yet have the power to act on this vision, but he had the perception to imagine it. In the cracks between poverty and violence, Luciano discovered his greatest strength: the ability to see the bigger picture long before anyone else even looked up. He wasn't just surviving the streets. He was learning how to rule the world that lay beyond them. Before Lucky Luciano reshaped the American underworld, he needed something far rarer than power: partners who could see the future with him. Men who were not bound by tradition, ego, or ethnic lines. Men who understood that the world of crime was evolving, and that only those who adapted would control its destiny. He found those men in Meyer Lansky and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel. The three came from different worlds: an Italian immigrant scraping by in the Lower East Side, a Jewish mathematical prodigy from a poor Belarusian family, and a handsome, thrill-seeking New Yorker with a violent streak. But beneath these differences lay the same hunger: the desire not just to survive the streets but to master them. This chapter explores how their unlikely alliance broke the rigid ethnic boundaries of early organized crime and laid the first pillars of a new criminal order: Luciano's Order. The encounter of minds. Luciano meets Lansky. The story of their partnership begins not with a deal, but with a confrontation. A teenage Luciano attempted to extort protection money from Jewish boys running small street games. Defiant among them stood Meyer Lansky, thin, quiet, confident, and utterly unafraid. When Lansky refused to pay, Luciano realized two things: this kid had spine, and this kid had a brain. Over the next months, Luciano watched Lansky more closely. Lansky ran numbers like an accountant, thought like a chess strategist, and carried himself with the calm focus of someone far older than he appeared. While most boys reacted, Lansky calculated. It was the first time Luciano saw someone on the streets who thought the way he did. They eventually struck up a cautious friendship. In another era, an Italian gangster and a Jewish mathematician teaming up would have been unthinkable. But Luciano felt no loyalty to ethnic pride, only to potential. And Lansky's potential was enormous. Together they began running small rackets, pooling their knowledge. Luciano handled people, negotiations, and street enforcement. Lansky handled strategy, risk, and numbers. The combination was electric. And in that chemistry, the Mafia's future quietly changed direction. Enter Bugsy Siegel, the necessary wild card. If Lansky was the mind, then Siegel was the spark. Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, volatile, fearless, dangerously charming, was the kind of man who could walk into a room and bend it to his will. He had a talent for intimidation and a reputation for unpredictable violence. Luciano usually avoided men like Siegel, too emotional, too impulsive, but Siegel wasn't just another street killer. He was loyal, ambitious, and most importantly, he was Lansky's closest friend. Luciano watched Siegel in action and recognized something critical. Siegel made things happen. He had connections, charisma, and a willingness to take risks others feared. He could intimidate without orders. He could negotiate when needed. And when violence was required, he delivered without hesitation. Together, the trio formed a perfect triangular balance. Luciano, vision and diplomacy; Lansky, intellect and structure; Siegel, force and presence. Three personalities, three strengths, one direction. Breaking barriers. A new kind of brotherhood in a world where Italians, Jews, and Irish rarely cooperated, and often killed each other. This alliance was revolutionary. Old Mafia bosses believed loyalty was tied to bloodlines. Luciano rejected this myth completely. He believed loyalty came from shared interest, not shared heritage. Where older Sicilians clung to ancient grudges, Luciano embraced multicultural collaboration. He saw in Lansky the financial mind the Italians lacked. He saw in Siegel the charisma and daring needed for expansion. And he saw in the partnership a new precedent. Crime didn't have to be tribal. Could be corporate. Could be cooperative. This was the first pillar of Luciano's hidden empire, an empire not built on ethnicity but on efficiency. The rackets grow. A new strategy emerges as teenagers transitioning into young men, their operations expanded rapidly. With Lansky's guidance, they refined gambling into a science. With Siegel's muscle, they secured territories without launching full-scale wars. Luciano used his Italian connections to bridge underworld families, ensuring their Jewish partners were protected and recognized. Their operations became so smooth that older gangsters couldn't help but notice. Their profits outpaced more established mobs. Their reliability attracted investors from the criminal world. And their multi-ethnic structure confused and frustrated traditional bosses, who couldn't understand why it worked. For Luciano, the lesson was clear. Collaboration produced stability. Stability produced profit. Profit produced power. A shared vision, and the birth of a blueprint. What truly united these three men was not only ambition, but imagination. All of them understood that the streets were too small for what they wanted. They talked often about the future, a criminal world organized like a business, with territories clearly divided, profits shared, wars minimized, conflict resolved through negotiation, and leaders chosen for competence, not bloodline. These ideas were unheard of at the time. But they resonated with all three. Lansky saw the mathematical efficiency. Luciano saw the political stability. Siegel saw the limitless potential for expansion. Together, they imagined a criminal syndicate connected across cities and ethnic groups, long before such a system existed. This vision would eventually become the Commission, but its earliest roots were planted in these youthful conversations on stoops, alleyways, and dimly lit pool halls. Why their alliance worked. The psychology behind the power. Luciano trusted Lansky because he recognized a mind as sharp as his own. He trusted Siegel because he knew exactly when to unleash fear, and when to hold it back. But above all, the alliance worked because none of them needed to be the center of attention. Luciano led quietly. Lansky advised quietly. Siegel executed loudly but only when needed. Their dynamic revealed a key truth about Luciano's rise. He became powerful not by ruling men, but by choosing the right ones to stand beside him. The first pillars of the empire. By their early 20s, the trio had laid the groundwork for a criminal order unlike anything before it. Multi-ethnic alliances, division of skill sets, strategic avoidance of unnecessary conflict, shared profits and shared risks, expansion-minded thinking. These weren't just improvements. They were innovations. Together, they introduced a level of sophistication that pushed the underworld toward its next phase. Their alliance was not just profitable, it was prophetic. In a world blinded by tradition, they saw possibility. In a world obsessed with fear, they built trust. In a world fragmented by ethnicity, they built unity. This was the beginning of Luciano's hidden empire, not yet visible, not yet formal, but already taking shape through alliances stronger than blood. Power in the old Mafia lived in two places, the knife and the code. Men trusted violence and they trusted omerta, the sacred vow of silence. It was meant to protect the brotherhood, shield secrets and bind loyalties so tightly that betrayal seemed impossible. But by the time Lucky Luciano entered the ranks of organized crime, omerta had become something else. Rigid, outdated, and often weaponized to protect incompetence rather than unity. Luciano saw this immediately. Where others followed omerta as unbreakable scripture, he saw it as a tool, a hidden language that could be refined, reshaped, and used to control not just words but entire systems of behavior. In his hands, omerta evolved from blind loyalty into strategic silence, into psychological warfare, into a means of negotiation more subtle, and far deadlier, than threats or bullets. This chapter explores how Luciano turned silence into power and how his psychological understanding of men became as lethal as any weapon he ever carried. Silence as intelligence. Not obedience to the old-world bosses, silence meant unquestioning loyalty. Do not speak, do not question, do not think. But Luciano understood something deeper. Silence is most powerful when it is voluntary, not forced. He noticed how men revealed everything when they felt safe, how fear made them talk too much, and how ego blinded them to their own vulnerabilities. So he treated omerta not as a muzzle but as a listening device. Luciano rarely spoke in meetings. He let others talk and they always did. By allowing rivals to dominate conversations, he learned their weaknesses, their insecurities, their ambitions. He learned the language behind their body language. He read the pauses between their words more carefully than the speeches themselves. Silence was not absence. Silence was analysis. Negotiation over noise. The rise of the diplomat Don Luciano believed most violence was unnecessary, not because he opposed it, but because he recognized its inefficiency. Every fight drew attention. Every murder cost money. Every feud weakened the organization he hoped to build. So he embraced negotiation, not the soft, hopeful kind but the calculated, ruthless kind. His negotiations were built on 3 principles. 1. Understand what a man fears. 2. Understand what a man wants. 3. Offer him a path where he receives enough of the second to silence the first. This was psychological warfare masked as diplomacy. Rivals who expected intimidation instead found themselves disarmed by unexpected calmness. Luciano could walk into a meeting charged with tension and walk out with allies. He had a talent for defusing egos before they exploded, for reminding men that profit tasted better than revenge. He negotiated not to avoid violence, but to make sure that when violence happened, it had purpose. The new omerta, a code of leverage. The traditional Sicilian omerta demanded total silence toward authorities. Luciano expanded this concept. Silence wasn't just about the outside world, it was about controlling information inside the underworld too. He created an environment where men spoke only in controlled fragments, meetings had unspoken boundaries, intermediaries carried messages in ways that could never be misinterpreted, loyalty was measured by discretion, not dramatic oaths. In essence, he established a new currency, trust measured through restraint. If a man talked too much, Luciano didn't need evidence to distrust him. The behavior itself was the evidence. And people knew this. His silence made others quieter. His calmness made others cautious. His reputation made others loyal. This was omerta redesigned, a psychological code rather than a ceremonial one. Subtle intimidation, power without raising a voice. Luciano rarely threatened anyone directly. He didn't need to. Men feared what he didn't say. His quiet demeanor carried a different kind of menace. The menace of unpredictability. With loud men you always knew where you stood. With Luciano, silence left room for imagination. And imagination is often far more terrifying than reality. He discovered that a slow nod could end an argument, a pause could shift loyalties, a cold stare could break a negotiation, a simple "we'll talk later" could send rivals into panic. Luciano mastered implied violence, the art of letting others imagine the consequences instead of showing them. In this way he extended power without expending energy. Diplomacy that felt like destiny. Luciano knew how to read a room the way others read newspapers. His psychological advantage came from recognizing emotional patterns. Who resented who feared who wanted more, who felt overlooked. He used this awareness to reshape relationships, redistribute influence, and nudge rivals toward cooperation rather than conflict. He created alliances not because he trusted others, but because he trusted his ability to manage them. Every man in his inner circle believed he was making his own decisions. In reality, Luciano guided those decisions with invisible threats. This was not manipulation for manipulation's sake. It was architecture, the careful redesign of underworld behavior. The mind that modernized the Mafia. Luciano's power didn't come from being the toughest man in the room. It came from being the man who understood the room, and everyone in it. He blended old world codes, new world strategy, psychological insight, and emotional restraint. His omerta was not silence enforced by fear. It was silence crafted by intention. His negotiations were not compromises. They were blueprints for stability. His psychological warfare wasn't cruelty. It was structural engineering. In a world addicted to noise, Luciano weaponized quiet. The beginning of a new order. By redefining omerta and mastering psychological leverage, Luciano created a foundation upon which his empire would be built. What others mistook for modesty or calmness was in fact the beginnings of a revolution in criminal power dynamics. He wasn't just influencing men, he was rewiring how the entire underworld communicated, cooperated, and calculated. And in this silence, in this hidden language of power, the seeds of an empire took root. Before Lucky Luciano, organized crime in America was a loose constellation of hustlers, gangs, and neighborhood bosses, each scrambling for scraps. Their operations were reactive, emotional, and wildly inconsistent. But Luciano saw something no one else did. Crime could be structured. Crime could be scalable. Crime could function like a corporation. Where others saw quick scores, he saw departments. Where others saw rackets, he saw revenue streams. Where others saw chaos, he saw an opportunity to build a machine. This chapter reveals how he turned scattered hustles into a unified criminal enterprise, an empire with hierarchy, systems, and long-term strategy. A corporate mind in a criminal world, Luciano approached crime with the mindset of a CEO. He didn't chase every dollar himself. He built frameworks through which dollars flowed upward. He delegated authority, established oversight, and created predictable profit structures across multiple operations. The underworld had never seen anything like it. To Luciano, the key to growth was centralized control with decentralized execution. Every racket was part of a larger system, and every player, from lieutenants to foot soldiers, had defined roles. Nothing was left to chance. Old bosses relied on fear. Luciano relied on infrastructure. Bootlegging, the first test of organization prohibition, offered criminals across America a golden opportunity, but few had the organizational intelligence to fully exploit it. Bootlegging required complex logistics. Sourcing alcohol, transporting it safely, bribing officials, distributing it efficiently, protecting routes. Most gangs handled these steps messily. Luciano streamlined them. He created 1. Supply teams to coordinate shipments from Canada and Caribbean sources. 2. Transportation units operating a fleet of trucks with rotating drivers. 3. Distribution cells delivering alcohol to speakeasies and nightclubs. 4. Protection crews managed by trusted enforcers like Bugsy Siegel. 5. Accounting systems overseen by Lansky, ensuring every dollar was tracked. For the first time, illegal alcohol moved like a commercial product. Predictable, organized, scalable. Bootlegging was no longer a gamble. It was a business. Gambling, turning chaos into a revenue engine. New York's gambling scene had always been fragmented, with small-time operators running backroom card games and local numbers operations. Luciano recognized that gambling had predictable demand. The issue wasn't supply, it was structure. He centralized gambling by creating protected gambling dens, standardizing odds and payouts, ensuring supervision by trusted captains, absorbing smaller operators into the network, funneling profits through a central treasury where old gambling operations collapsed under police pressure or internal cheating. Luciano's operations survived because he removed volatility. He ensured consistency, fairness within criminal standards, and efficiency. Under his system, gambling became a steady income stream, not a risky hustle. Prostitution. Reorganizing a broken system. Prostitution had long been one of the most unstable rackets. Poorly managed, prone to violence, and frequently busted by police. Old-school pimps ruled by brutality, but brutality was inefficient and unpredictable. Luciano reorganized prostitution into a more structured, business-like system. Houses replaced street-level hustling. These brothels operated under managers instead of pimps. Standardized pricing and schedules. Women were rotated to reduce burnout and suspicion from authorities. A medical supervision. Regular checkups ensured the racket didn't collapse from illness outbreaks. Centralized profit collection. Managers turned over revenue weekly, and percentages flowed up the hierarchy. Luciano wasn't moral, he was practical. He removed unnecessary violence because it endangered profit. His streamlined approach made prostitution less erratic and far more profitable, which later became the basis for Dewey's prosecution. Narcotics. The silent pipeline. Although controversial even within the Mafia, Luciano recognized that narcotics were financially unavoidable. When older dons rejected drug trafficking as dirty and risky, Luciano took a different approach. He compartmentalized the operation. Distribution was separated from leadership. Couriers didn't know suppliers. Suppliers didn't know financiers. Each layer was insulated from the next. This reduced exposure and minimized the chance of betrayal. By structuring narcotics like a sophisticated supply chain, Luciano ensured reliability and secrecy, two things rarely seen in early drug trafficking. Union infiltration. The corporate expansion. One of Luciano's greatest innovations was taking organized crime into labor unions. He realized unions offered steady income, political influence, leverage over construction, ports, trucking, and manufacturing, the ability to freeze or accelerate business across the city. He placed trusted lieutenants inside unions as advisors or security consultants. Soon, companies seeking labor peace had to negotiate with the Mafia. These negotiations weren't conducted with guns, they were conducted with contracts and quiet threats. Unions gave Luciano something money alone never could: legitimacy and reach. Delegation. The core of his power. Luciano never pretended he could run every racket personally. Instead, he built a management pyramid, top tier. Luciano, Lansky, Siegel, vision, high-level decisions, intergang diplomacy. Middle tier, trusted captains overseeing gambling dens, distribution operations and union networks. Lower tier, street soldiers, bookkeepers, drivers, enforcers, workers with narrow, defined tasks. This structure meant operations continued even during arrests, income remained stable, leadership remained insulated, betrayal became harder and less damaging. Luciano designed his empire so the machine could run even without him. And eventually it did. From hustles to empire, the legacy of organization. By the early 1930s, Luciano had done the impossible. He took scattered hustles and turned them into industries. He took dangerous men and turned them into departments. He took chaos and turned it into machinery. Crime, under Luciano, became a business, with strategy, hierarchy, and long-term planning. He didn't just control rackets, he standardized them. He didn't just lead men, he engineered systems. And in doing so, he built the framework that allowed the Mafia to dominate American cities for decades. The machine he built was invisible, efficient, and far more powerful than any single gangster could ever be. Lucky Luciano understood something most criminals never realized. Real power isn't taken, it's negotiated. And sometimes it's purchased. While other gangsters waged wars in alleyways and fought for street corners, Luciano targeted a very different battlefield. Institutions, the political machines, police departments, judges, ward leaders, precinct captains, and informants who quietly determined the fate of every arrest, every raid, and every election in New York. To Luciano, the underworld was only half the map. The real empire included men who wore suits in City Hall, badges on their chests and robes on their benches. This chapter exposes those hidden alliances, the secret architecture of influence that allowed Luciano to operate not merely as a criminal, but as a shadow statesman. The political machines, where crime met governance. At the dawn of the 20th century, New York politics was dominated by Tammany Hall, a powerful democratic machine that controlled jobs, contracts, votes, and policing with iron precision. This was not clean politics, this was transactional governance. Luciano recognized immediately that Tammany Hall wasn't just a political force. It was an opportunity. He began forging relationships with ward bosses and district leaders, men who controlled the immigrant vote. These alliances offered him protection for his gambling dens, reduced police pressure, insider information on raids, political cover for his associates. In exchange, Luciano delivered what political machines needed most: votes, muscle, and money. On election day, Luciano's men ensured turnout in key districts. In return, politicians ensured leniency in courtrooms. It was a symbiotic cycle, each side feeding the other. Luciano wasn't infiltrating politics, he was integrating with it. Bribery as strategy, not desperation. Where lesser criminals used bribery impulsively, Luciano treated it like investment. Every payoff was calculated. Which captain influenced which precinct? Which judge owed favors to which politician? Which officer was overworked, underpaid, or quietly corruptible? Which reporters could kill stories before they spread? Luciano built a spreadsheet in his mind long before spreadsheets existed. His bribes weren't random cash exchanges. They were contracts, silent agreements that formed a second government operating beneath the first. He even tiered his payments. Low-level officers received routine envelopes. Detectives received larger payments tied to specific cases. Captains and lieutenants received long-term retainers, support in exchange for stability. Politicians received campaign contributions disguised as community gifts. Nothing was dirty to Luciano unless it was inefficient. Bribery, as he practiced it, was simply lubrication for the machinery he was building. The informant web, eyes everywhere. Luciano's empire thrived on information. He valued intelligence even more than muscle. He cultivated bartenders, cab drivers, low-ranking clerks in municipal offices, secretaries in police precincts, union workers stationed at docks. These people weren't gangsters. They were observers. They overheard whispers, caught glimpses of documents, or sensed shifts in political winds. Luciano paid them modestly but consistently. These informants fed him a steady diet of updates: pending raids, grand jury activity, internal rivalries inside police units, suspicious officers who might be turning honest. This network allowed Luciano to act before others even knew there was a problem. He didn't just react to threats, he anticipated them. The police, enemies, partners, pawns. Contrary to the popular myth, Luciano didn't bribe all police. He didn't need to. He only needed to bribe the right ones. He understood the psychology of law enforcement. Some were idealists, unbribable. He avoided them entirely. Some were ambitious, they wanted connections. He cultivated them. Some were compromised, drowning in debt, desperate for extra income. These became long-term assets. Luciano never overpaid. Overpaying made officers greedy. Instead, he paid enough to keep them comfortable and loyal, and just vulnerable enough that betrayal could ruin them. He used this leverage subtly. A lieutenant who accepted bribes became responsible for ensuring quieter streets. A detective on the payroll ensured that evidence disappeared. A precinct captain made sure raids happened on rivals, not friends. Luciano turned police corruption into policy, predictable, manageable, weaponized. Judges and courtrooms. Influence at the final gate. Luciano's political allies sometimes placed judges in courts that handled vice, gambling, and misdemeanors. These judges didn't acquit men openly. That would have attracted suspicion. Instead, they used bureaucratic sabotage. Cases dismissed for insufficient evidence, warrants invalidated on technicalities, delays until witnesses disappeared, reduced sentencing quietly pushed through. Luciano never asked for miracles. He asked for nudges. And those nudges changed the underworld. He learned that if a judge protects your soldiers protect your empire. Media allies. The invisible shield. In an era when newspapers shaped public reality, Luciano made sure he had friends in key positions. Certain editors received holiday gifts. Certain reporters received exclusive stories in exchange for burying others. Luciano understood narrative control long before modern PR existed. He kept his name low, his rivals' names high, and his empire safe behind silence. The blurring line between crime and governance. By the early 1930s, Luciano had woven a web so intricate that distinguishing between his influence and the city's formal power structures became nearly impossible. His lessons were simple but revolutionary. Brutality wins battles. Alliances win empires. Crime flourishes when institutions fracture, but thrives when institutions cooperate. Fear controls men, influence controls systems. Luciano wasn't merely bribing officials. He was integrating crime into governance, creating a shadow network that mirrored, and sometimes outperformed, the legitimate one. He operated not beside the government but within the cracks of it. This was his true genius. He didn't need to overthrow institutions. He simply learned how to turn them. The legacy of an invisible empire. Other gangsters ruled through intimidation. Luciano ruled through architecture. He built alliances across politics, law enforcement, unions, media, businesses. This was the invisible infrastructure of his empire, the part no jury could see, no detective could map, and no rival could destroy. His power did not lie in bullets or bribes alone. It lived in relationships, leverage, and access. Through these networks, Luciano blurred the line between governance and crime so effectively that decades later, historians still struggle to separate the two. He didn't just conquer the underworld. He colonized the world above it. Before the Castellamarese War erupted, the Mafia in America was already fragile. A loose network of rival bosses pretending stability while quietly plotting against one another. But when two titans, Joe the Boss Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano, collided for absolute control of the underworld, that fragile world shattered completely. The conflict that followed was not simply a gang war. It was a civil war, violent, chaotic, and strategic. A war that threatened to burn the entire criminal landscape to the ground. And in the middle of that fire stood Lucky Luciano, a man who fought like a participant but thought like an architect. Two kings, one underworld. Masuria ruled as the traditional strongman, crude, loud, superstitious, and deadly. He demanded loyalty, tribute, and unquestioning obedience. In his mind, the Mafia was a personal kingdom, and every soldier his servant. Maranzano, newly arrived from Sicily, presented himself as the opposite, educated, strategic, and disciplined. He viewed himself as a Roman emperor in the making, ready to impose order through structure and hierarchy. But beneath this sophistication lay the same flaw: he wanted to be king. Two men chasing the same throne. Two visions rooted in the past. One underworld too small for both. War became inevitable. Violence takes over the streets. The first shots of the Castellamarese War were not declarations, they were assassinations. Soldiers vanished overnight. Business owners were caught in crossfire. Bodies turned up in alleys, stairwells, and cars abandoned on dark streets. No one knew who would be next. No one felt safe. No one trusted alliances that had held for years. Old loyalties splintered. New betrayals were bought daily. The Mafia, once governed by silent codes, had descended into a survival game where every man feared the people closest to him. Luciano, participant by force, strategist by choice. Luciano was technically a Masuria man, but not by conviction. He had seen the limits of Masuria's leadership long before the war began. Masuria was outdated, impulsive, and obsessed with Sicilian purity, a mindset Luciano believed would destroy them all. But Maranzano was no savior either. He wanted absolute rule, dressed in Roman symbolism. Luciano understood what neither boss could admit: the Mafia didn't need a king, it needed a system. Yet to build that system both kings would have to fall. So Luciano played a dangerous role: loyal soldier on the surface, strategist in the shadows. He attended Masuria's meetings, executed orders, and gathered intelligence. But behind the scenes he maintained quiet communication with Maranzano's people. Not betrayal, preparation. Luciano wasn't choosing a side. He was studying them. Survival, the test that defined him. One night, Luciano's balancing act nearly collapsed. He was kidnapped, beaten, stabbed, and left on a beach to die. The attack was almost certainly from Masuria's circle, suspicious of his cross-faction negotiations. Luciano survived. His recovery was slow, painful, but transformative. As he lay bandaged in a dim apartment, one realization crystallized: the war would kill him unless he ended it. And ending it meant dismantling both men who claimed to lead him. Strategic betrayal, the beginning of the end. Luciano offered Maranzano a secret deal: end Masuria and he would support a new order. Maranzano agreed, believing he had just secured the loyalty of the most promising young gangster in America. Luciano then baited Masuria into a trap. He arranged a meeting at a Coney Island restaurant, excused himself under the pretense of using the restroom, and left moments before gunmen stormed the room. Masuria died with playing cards still in his hands. To outsiders, it looked like a decisive victory for Maranzano. But Luciano knew better. He hadn't chosen Maranzano. He had chosen the timing. The rise of Maranzano, and the realization that changed everything. With Masuria gone, Maranzano crowned himself Capo di tutti capi, boss of all bosses. He reorganized the Mafia into 5 families, distributing territories with military precision. On paper this looked like order. But Maranzano's system had one fatal flaw: him. He demanded tribute. He ordered surveillance on Luciano's allies. He created hit lists of men he viewed as threats, Luciano's name among them. Luciano recognized a pattern. Maranzano wasn't building a new Mafia. He was rebuilding an old tyranny. The war wasn't over. It had simply changed uniforms. The second betrayal, a coup to save the future. Luciano realized he had to act again, quickly and decisively. Unlike Masuria, Maranzano surrounded himself exclusively with Sicilian bodyguards, loyal men who would never allow an Italian-American like Luciano near him during a hit. So Luciano innovated. He hired Jewish hitmen, men Maranzano wouldn't recognize and therefore wouldn't fear. On September 10, 1931, these assassins entered Maranzano's office disguised as federal agents. Within minutes, the self-made Roman emperor was dead. 2 kings removed through 2 quiet coups. Luciano had done what the Mafia itself couldn't articulate. He ended a war that threatened to consume everyone. From bloodshed to blueprint, the Castellamarese War left scars across the underworld: dead soldiers, grieving families, empty neighborhoods, shuttered businesses. Yet from this devastation rose something extraordinary: a chance to rebuild. Luciano seized it. He abolished the idea of a boss of all bosses. He replaced monarchy with a governing council, the Commission. He introduced cooperation between families rather than domination by one. The war had forced the Mafia to evolve. Luciano ensured it evolved in the right direction. The architect emerges. By the end of 1931, Luciano was no longer merely a survivor of the Castellamarese War. He was its architect, the man who had navigated chaos with vision, tempered violence with strategy, and replaced a broken system with a modern structure. He fought in the streets, but he thought above them. He participated in the war, but he planned for the peace after it. He betrayed men, but only to build something larger than any man. The Castellamarese War didn't just change the Mafia. It revealed Luciano's true identity: not a gangster chasing power, but a designer building a new order. When the smoke of the Castellamarese War finally cleared in 1931, the Mafia stood at a crossroads. 2 bosses were dead, dozens of soldiers buried, and every family shaken by betrayal and violence. The old system, built on Sicilian tradition and absolute rulers, had collapsed under its own weight. For the first time in American Mafia history, there was no king, no undisputed leader, no single force capable of restoring stability. Into this vacuum stepped Lucky Luciano. Not as a conqueror but as an architect. He understood a truth that no Sicilian don had ever admitted: absolute power created absolute instability. Every time one man seized total control, the rest united to destroy him. The Mafia didn't need another supreme ruler. It needed a governing structure, a system that could distribute authority, resolve disputes, and keep the organization profitable without the constant threat of internal war. That system became the Commission, the greatest innovation in the history of organized crime. The vision, replacing kings with a council. Luciano's plan was radical. Eliminate the concept of a boss of all bosses, and replace it with a multi-family board that represented all major interests. Each boss would retain autonomy within his own territory, but major decisions would be made collectively. This was not compromise. This was strategy. Luciano designed the commission to achieve three critical goals. 1. Prevent internal wars through negotiated dispute resolution. 2. Manage national criminal enterprises with shared oversight. 3. Distribute power so no single man could dominate the entire underworld. For a criminal world addicted to hierarchy and ego, this idea was revolutionary. Structure. A criminal board of directors. The commission's structure mirrored that of a corporate board. Permanent members, the heads of the 5 families in New York, Luciano, later Castello, Prophesy Mangano, Bonanno, Gagliano. Each family controlled a territory but answered to the commission for major decisions like murders, expansions, and alliances. In national representation, outside New York, powerful syndicates like the Chicago outfit, then under Johnny Torrio's influence, and the Buffalo family were given seats, solidifying the commission as a national governing body. Advisory voices, trusted non-Italian allies such as Meyer Lansky acted as unofficial advisors, men without titles but with deep influence in national operations. This blend of regional power and shared governance created the first stable structure in Mafia history. Standardized rules, order to replace chaos. The commission introduced a series of rules that reshaped the underworld. 1. No major hits without commission approval. This prevented impulsive murders that could ignite wars. 2. Disputes must be mediated, not fought. Bosses could present grievances, but violence became the last resort. 3. Territory lines were formalized. This eliminated constant turf battles. 4. Joint ventures were encouraged. Rackets that crossed borders, narcotics, gambling circuits, labor racketeering, were managed collectively. 5. Leadership succession had to be transparent. No more coups based on paranoia or tradition. These rules didn't eliminate crime, they eliminated chaos. A national network, expansion beyond New York. Luciano's commission expanded quickly, connecting cities that had once operated in isolation. Chicago, Cleveland, Detroit, Buffalo, and Philadelphia all integrated into the new system. For the first time in American history, organized crime functioned as a national enterprise, a coordinated network, a unified economic engine. Rackets were standardized. Profits flowed predictably. Violence decreased dramatically, replaced by meetings, votes, and negotiated agreements. The Mafia was no longer a set of feuding tribes. It had become a corporation. Luciano's role, chairman without the title. Though Luciano refused the title of supreme boss, he remained the commission's most influential figure. Not because he demanded obedience, but because he engineered the structure itself. His leadership style was subtle. He moderated disputes without taking sides. He recommended strategies that maximized profit. He encouraged innovation, especially in gambling and unions. He protected the interests of smaller families to maintain balance. He ruled not by fear, but by credibility. Every boss knew that Luciano's decisions were driven by logic, not ego. And logic, in the criminal world, was rare enough to inspire loyalty. The commission's revolutionary impact. Luciano's creation produced effects that transformed organized crime for decades. Internal wars became rare. The violent feuds that once defined the Mafia evaporated. Disputes were solved in boardrooms, not alleyways. Profits skyrocketed. Cooperation replaced competition. Multi-city rackets, especially narcotics and labor infiltration, grew into national powerhouses. Ethnic boundaries weakened. Jewish, Irish, and Italian syndicates integrated into a wider network of collaboration. Law enforcement became confused and outmaneuvered. Instead of chasing one dominant boss, authorities now faced a decentralized structure with no single point of failure. The Mafia gained political influence. Unified power meant unified leverage, especially in unions, construction, shipping, and local governments. Through the commission, organized crime matured into a sophisticated, self-regulating institution. The quiet genius behind it all. Luciano's brilliance lay not in brutality but in architecture. He understood something profound. You don't control men, you control systems. and systems control men. The commission was not merely an innovation, it was a philosophy. A recognition that decentralized power prevented rebellions, stabilized profits, and extended the lifespan of the entire organization. Under Luciano's influence, crime stopped behaving like a battlefield and started behaving like a business. The blueprint that outlived him long after Luciano was imprisoned and then exiled, the commission continued to function. Even during the Mafia's golden age of the 1940s and 50s, its influence shaped every major decision. It was resilient. It adapted. It survived. Luciano had created something greater than an empire, he created a blueprint. A model so effective that criminal organizations worldwide adopted it, from the Sicilian Mafia's cupola to South American cartels and Eastern European syndicates. This was his quiet revolution, a board of directors for crime. A constitution for chaos. A governing body where power was not seized but balanced. The birth of modern organized crime. The commission was the moment the Mafia became more than gangs and bosses. It became an institution. And at the heart of that transformation was a single man, a strategist who understood that violence builds kingdoms, but structure builds empires. Lucky Luciano didn't just participate in history. He designed it. 4 years, Lucky Luciano operated inside a world he had engineered. A lattice of alliances, silent favors, bribed officials, and invisible deals that kept him untouchable. His power didn't roar, it whispered. It spread through rooms he never entered and decisions he never openly made. But empires built on hidden structure face one fatal vulnerability. Once the structure becomes visible, it becomes a target. By the early 1930s, Luciano's influence had grown so vast, so sophisticated, that it began drawing attention from places he had hoped would stay blind. Prosecutors, journalists, political reformers, and jealous rivals inside the underworld. His brilliance had made him invisible for years. Now that same brilliance made him a threat everyone needed to expose. The shadows he once controlled began to follow him. A changing wind, the reformers' rise. America was shifting. Prohibition was losing steam. The public was beginning to tire of corruption stories, rigged elections, and mob shootouts. Politicians sensed opportunity in clean government rhetoric, and ambitious young prosecutors saw the chance to build careers by attacking organized crime. At the center of this shift stood Thomas E. Dewey, a relentless, intelligent, publicity-savvy prosecutor whose rise to power aligned perfectly with the growing appetite to expose the Mafia. Dewey didn't see Luciano as a gangster. He saw him as a symbol. A symbol he could destroy to claim a political future. And symbols make irresistible targets. Journalists smell blood. For years the press barely mentioned Luciano. He avoided headlines. He avoided spectacle. He avoided the loud moves that made other gangsters famous and vulnerable. But as whispers of a criminal syndicate began circulating, journalists grew hungry for a face, a name, a figure to place at the center of the narrative. They wanted a kingpin, a mastermind. Luciano, despite his caution, fit the role perfectly. Reporters described him as the silent Don, the shadow behind New York crime, the architect hiding in plain sight. The stories exaggerated his power, but the exaggerations did not hurt him at first, they defined him. His mystique became intoxicating. But mystique soon turned to scrutiny. And scrutiny to suspicion. The invisibility cloak he had worn so well began to glow. Cracks from within. Rivals smell opportunity within the Mafia. Power attracts envy just as quickly as it attracts respect. Luciano's rise, his modern ideas, and his multi-ethnic alliances created resentment among traditionalists and opportunists alike. Some Sicilian purists hated his rejection of old-world dominance. Some bosses feared his influence within the commission. Some men simply wanted what he had. When the government began sniffing around, certain rivals fed investigators information, not enough to destroy him outright, but enough to point prosecutors in the right direction. To them, weakening Luciano meant strengthening themselves. Every empire has internal traitors. Luciano's was no exception. The web becomes visible. Luciano had always operated by connecting legitimate power with illegitimate need. Politicians who wanted votes, businessmen who wanted protection, police officers who wanted extra cash, judges who wanted political favor. But these networks depended on silence. Once government investigators started mapping connections, names, patterns, and financial trails, they began seeing a shape, a structure, behind New York's criminal economy. The Mafia wasn't a collection of disconnected gangs. It was a system. And Luciano was the only man who fit at its center. Investigators didn't have evidence yet. But they had a theory. A theory powerful enough to justify surveillance, raids, and intense investigation. For the first time, Luciano felt the ground under him shift. Dewey's obsession, turning suspicion into mission. Thomas Dewey moved not like a prosecutor but like a tactician. He studied Luciano the way Luciano studied rivals, by analyzing patterns, relationships, and human behavior. Dewey realized something crucial. Luciano's power came from the invisibility of his networks. Destroy the networks and the man falls. Dewey went after low-level operators, brothel owners, bookkeepers, frightened runners, anyone who could provide a name, a face, a thread. He didn't need the truth. He needed consistency. Enough testimonies, even imperfect ones, could create a narrative that the public would believe and juries would accept. Dewey didn't build a case, he built a story. A story in which Luciano was the mastermind of vice. Once the story caught fire, evidence became secondary. The press joins the hunt as Dewey's investigation gained momentum, the media amplified it. Every rumor became a headline. Every whisper became a scandal. Luciano's previous invisibility transformed into unwanted fame. He was photographed leaving restaurants, followed by reporters. Discussed in editorial pages as public enemy number one, though he had never fired a public shot. Luciano found himself fighting an enemy he couldn't bribe, intimidate, or negotiate with: public perception. And perception shapes prosecution. The underworld pulls away as pressure mounted. Some of Luciano's allies quietly began distancing themselves. Not out of betrayal, out of survival. Politicians stopped returning calls. Police captains reduced cooperation. Union leaders avoided meetings. Even certain mob figures hesitated to meet him in public. The web he designed to be flexible and resilient suddenly became fragile. The harder the government pulled, the more strands snapped. The hunter becomes the hunted. Luciano, once the mastermind who controlled countless moving parts, was now forced into reactive mode. He changed meeting spots frequently, reduced communication, avoided public appearances, even altered his routines. This was unfamiliar territory for him, not danger but visibility. He had always thrived in silence. Now the world refused to stop looking at him. A storm gathering on the horizon. By the mid-1930s, one thing became undeniable. Luciano's invisibility, the very thing that had built his empire, had been compromised. His networks were being mapped. His alliances scrutinized. His enemies emboldened. His image reshaped into a target. He had become the face of organized crime, not by choice but by narrative. And once a man becomes a symbol, the world no longer seeks justice. It seeks spectacle. The storm had arrived. And Luciano, for the first time, was standing in the open. By 1936, Lucky Luciano's empire stood like a cathedral of shadows, vast, silent, and meticulously engineered. 4 years he had avoided the spotlight, operating through layers of proxies, intermediaries, and whispered agreements. But now, for the first time, that cathedral faced a threat it had never encountered. A prosecutor who understood performance just as well as he understood law. Thomas E. Dewey was not merely building a case. He was staging a public reckoning. And the trial that followed, the People vs. Charles Lucky Luciano, would become the theater where the invisible underworld was dragged, screaming, into the light. The courtroom as a stage. From the moment the trial began, the courtroom felt electric. Benches overflowed with journalists who scribbled every gesture, every whisper, every strained expression. Spectators packed the gallery as if attending a Broadway opening. Even the jury sensed they were witnessing something historic. Luciano entered each day impeccably dressed, composed, almost regal. But beneath the surface, he felt the weight of something he had never faced: visibility. He could no longer hide behind lieutenants or alliances. His silence, once a shield, now appeared incriminating. Across the room stood Dewey, sharp, controlled, relentless. This wasn't a clash of men. It was a clash of philosophies. Luciano's invisible empire versus Dewey's public crusade. Building the narrative, how Dewey crafted the myth. Dewey's genius was not in evidence. It was in strategy. He knew he couldn't convict Luciano on murder or racketeering. Luciano was too careful, too insulated. So Dewey focused on the one racket where witnesses could be compelled: prostitution. He constructed a narrative in which Luciano was the mastermind of a citywide vice network, the silent force behind hundreds of brothels, the man whose approval was needed for every illicit dollar earned. Whether this narrative was fully accurate didn't matter. It felt true to jurors hungry for a villain. Dewey called brothel owners madams, street-level workers, people frightened, desperate, or easily pressured. Many had never met Luciano. Many repeated hearsay. Some contradicted themselves. But Dewey didn't need perfect witnesses. He needed volume. Witness by witness, accusation by accusation, he built a rhythm, a drumbeat of guilt. And the courtroom, starved for drama, swallowed it eagerly. Luciano under the spotlight for the first time, Luciano felt what it meant to be hunted openly. In the underworld, danger had always been silent, a whisper, a rumor, a shadow behind him. But here, danger spoke loudly through microphones and sworn oaths. He sat stone-faced, hands folded, watching strangers paint him as a tyrant of the night. His instinct was to dismiss them, but this was not the street. This was a courtroom where emotion mattered more than truth. Luciano's frustration grew when he realized his invisible system, once genius, now worked against him. The very distance he maintained from operations made him appear like a puppet master. Silence, which once protected him, now looked like guilt. The witness storm. Testimonies that reshaped the narrative. One witness described being beaten by pimps who invoked Luciano's name. Another testified she handed money to intermediaries who claimed they reported to him. A third, trembling, insisted that everyone knew Lucky was the boss. None of this proved guilt. All of it suggested guilt. Dewey didn't need a smoking gun. He needed myth, and Luciano's myth had grown so large that even lies felt plausible. Every story chipped away at Luciano's invisibility. Every accusation made his empire appear less like a network of equals and more like a dictatorship of shadows. The press amplified the spectacle, printing front-page headlines until the city believed they were watching the fall of a monster. The narrative hardened. Luciano was the unseen hand behind everything. He wasn't just on trial for prostitution. He was on trial for the idea of his power. Defense in a losing battle. Luciano's attorney, George Morton Levy, fought hard. He questioned inconsistencies, exposed contradictions, and demonstrated how many witnesses had been coerced or bribed for testimony. He reminded the jury, no witness had ever met Luciano personally. No financial records tied him to brothels. No evidence connected him to violence. But Dewey had shifted the battleground away from evidence and toward emotion. And emotion rarely listens to logic. Luciano's empire had always relied on invisibility. Now that invisibility looked sinister. The jury didn't need certainty, they needed a story. And Dewey gave them a story they could believe. Public outrage. The court of opinion makes its verdict first. By the final week of testimony, the trial had become a national obsession. Women's groups protested outside the courthouse. Moral reformers declared Luciano a symbol of everything corrupt in American life. Editorials demanded a conviction, not for the crime he was accused of, but for the power he represented. Luciano could feel his networks collapsing from afar. Politicians distanced themselves. Compromised officers disappeared. Even fellow mobsters refused visible support. The man who once blended into shadows was now the brightest target in the country. Dewey's final strike, a closing argument for the ages. Dewey's closing argument was a masterpiece of performance. He framed Luciano not as a man but as a system, a structure of crime woven into every corner of the city. He thundered, "He does not need to touch the money. His word is enough." Luciano had built an empire where orders rarely needed to be spoken. Now that subtlety condemned him. He had created a hierarchy. Now prosecutors said he commanded it. He had remained invisible. Now prosecutors said only a mastermind could do so. The empire he engineered became the noose around his neck. The collapse. The verdict that changed everything. After only hours of deliberation, the jury returned, guilty on 62 counts. Luciano didn't flinch, but inside he understood the truth. He wasn't convicted for what he did. He was convicted for what he represented. The Dewey offensive had succeeded. It unmasked his networks, shattered his invisibility, and transformed a legend into a prisoner. Lucky Luciano's empire had survived wars, rivalries, betrayals, and bullets. But it could not survive exposure. When the prison gates closed behind Lucky Luciano in 1936, many believed they had finally contained the mastermind of America's criminal underworld. Bars, walls, and guards, these were supposed to sever his connections, choke his influence, and reduce him to another inmate lost in the system. But they underestimated the truth Luciano had always known. Power does not depend on presence. It depends on networks, loyalty, and the ability to move pieces without touching them. Prison took his freedom but not his architecture. Behind thick stone walls, Luciano did not vanish. He adapted. A new territory, learning the prison system. Clinton Correctional Facility was a world with rigid hierarchies, unwritten rules, and its own economy. Most men feared the adjustment. Luciano analyzed it. Within weeks, he understood how goods moved, how favors were exchanged, and which guards bent under pressure. He didn't intimidate his way into influence, he observed his way in. His reputation followed him like a shadow. Some inmates approached him with reverence, others with curiosity. Guards, even those who disliked him, treated him cautiously. The myth of Lucky Luciano entered before he did. But Luciano did not attempt to rule the prison. He aimed to exist strategically within it. He created alliances, avoided unnecessary conflicts, and positioned himself as a problem solver, the same way he had shaped the streets. Soon, disputes among inmates quietly came to him before erupting into violence. He was no longer a boss. He was an advisor, and advisors often wield more power than kings. Coded messages, a language only his world understood. Luciano's true influence remained outside the prison, where the machinery he had built still turned. His lieutenants continued running gambling, narcotics, and union rackets. They needed guidance. And Luciano needed updates. Communication required creativity. Letters home contained seemingly innocent references. A sick cousin meant a troubled associate. A shipment of shirts signaled incoming product. A wedding invitation hinted at a meeting. These weren't codes invented in prison. These were codes the Mafia had used for decades. But Luciano refined them, embedding meaning in rhythm, punctuation, even handwriting flourishes. He communicated through letters that never said what they meant, lawyers who acted as couriers, visitors who carried verbal instructions, corrupt guards who facilitated discreet exchanges. The state had locked up a man, but it had not locked away his systems. Residual loyalty, the empire that refused to die. Luciano's power in prison didn't come from fear. It came from residual loyalty, the loyalty created by years of fairness, strategy, and vision. 3 forces kept his influence alive. 1. Respect for his role in ending the Castellamarese War. Bosses across America knew they owed their stability to Luciano's architecture. That memory alone kept alliances intact. 2. The commission he had designed. Even without him present, the structure functioned. Decisions passed through committees, not dictators. But when disputes arose, many still sought his opinion unofficially. 3. His personal charisma and negotiating history. Luciano didn't dictate. He advised, which made his advice harder to ignore. Even rivals who had once resented him now found themselves benefiting from the stability he'd created. He was in a cell. But his blueprint governed the streets. A nation at war, and the Mafia at the docks. When World War II began, America feared Axis sabotage on its domestic shores. The port of New York, the largest in the world, was vulnerable. Rumors spread of German agents infiltrating dockworkers. Then came the Normandy fire in 1942. A massive French liner, burned while docked in Manhattan. Whether sabotage or accident, the panic was real. The U.S. government needed control over the docks. And the docks were controlled by the Mafia. Specifically by Luciano's network. Authorities approached Meyer Lansky, who served as the bridge. Lansky assured them that Luciano could help secure the waterfront, if the government was willing to negotiate. It was a strange moment in American history, a nation at war turning to a prisoner for protection. Operation Underworld, an unlikely alliance. Luciano agreed to assist. Not out of patriotism but out of strategy. He still possessed influence among longshoremen, union bosses, and street captains. His blessing could enforce cooperation more effectively than any government mandate. With his subtle direction, Mafia-controlled dockworkers minimized theft, reduced sabotage risk, and reported suspicious activity through covert channels. In exchange, Luciano hoped for one thing: leniency. His help was indispensable. Federal officials, though uncomfortable with the arrangement, quietly acknowledged his contribution. It was a final reminder of a truth the world often forgot. Luciano didn't need freedom to remain relevant. He needed leverage, and he always found it. Influence, even in decline. As the war ended and his sentence neared reconsideration, Luciano's influence slowly shifted. He was still respected, but the next generation of gangsters, ambitious, impatient, modern, began shaping their own identities. The world evolved, and with it, the need for Luciano's direct guidance diminished. He felt this change, and it marked the beginning of an emotional erosion. But not yet the end of his influence. Because even behind bars he had accomplished something extraordinary. He kept the Mafia cohesive. He kept the docks secure for the U.S. Navy. He kept his name feared, respected, and strategically valuable. No prison wall, no verdict, no prosecutor succeeded in cutting him off from the world he built. Luciano had always ruled from the shadows. Prison only made the shadows deeper. When Lucky Luciano stepped onto the ship that would deport him to Italy in 1946, he walked up the plank with the posture of a man who understood the meaning of exile. You do not just lose a country, you lose your place in the world. He had traded a prison cell for open skies, but freedom meant nothing without the streets he once ruled, the networks he once shaped, and the empire he once guided with a quiet hand. America had been his battleground, his laboratory, his creation. Italy was a memory, and not a fond one. Luciano sailed away not just from New York but from relevance. Arrival in Italy, a stranger at home when he arrived in Naples, the air was thick with post-war exhaustion. Buildings were scarred, people worn thin, and black markets thriving in the rubble. Italian authorities treated him not as a returning immigrant but as an imported threat. Police followed him everywhere, taking notes, demanding identification, questioning visitors. Luciano felt like an exhibit, watched, contained, mistrusted. Even more disorienting was the emotional shock. Italy no longer felt like home. America no longer felt reachable. He was suspended between two worlds, belonging fully to neither. He had designed a system so strong it outlived him, and now he had to face that truth without the buffer of power. Reinventing power, the attempt to stay relevant in exile, Luciano tried to reassemble the threads of influence he once controlled effortlessly. He reached out to American contacts, attempting to guide narcotics routes through Italy and Cuba. His name still commanded respect, and many younger gangsters treated him as a mentor. But respect is not the same as control. As years passed, Luciano found himself reduced to an advisor, not a leader. The commission he had designed operated without him. The new generation of bosses, men like Vito Genovese and Frank Costello, no longer needed his direction. They listened out of courtesy, not obligation. Luciano felt something he had never felt before: irrelevance nibbling at the edges of his identity. He tried moving to Havana briefly, hoping proximity to American mobsters would restore some of his strategic power, but the U.S. government demanded his removal. Within weeks he was deported again, back to Italy, back to invisibility. The world he once controlled now pushed him away from every angle. Shifting criminal landscapes, a new order he didn't recognize by the 1950s, organized crime had evolved into something more aggressive, more fragmented, and far more international. Narcotics routes expanded into Southeast Asia. Syndicates grew less loyal to tradition. Money flowed in darker, more unpredictable channels. Luciano had once believed he could oversee the new drug trade from exile. But the trade expanded faster than he could manage. And younger men were hungrier, riskier, and far less interested in consensus. For the first time in his life, the underworld felt alien. The commission still honored his legacy, but they no longer sought his input. The quiet rooms where he once negotiated peace were replaced with more violent decision-making. His architecture remained, but the architects after him started building extensions he no longer understood. Luciano had built a machine. Now the machine was running itself, and running past him. The emotional unraveling, nostalgia and frustration. Luciano spent more time looking back than forward. He walked Naples' waterfront imagining the docks of New York. He sat in cafes replaying conversations with Lansky and Siegel. He reread old letters looking for signs of the man he once had been. Nostalgia became both comfort and torment. He missed the thrill of negotiation, the adrenaline of managing crises, the quiet satisfaction of outthinking rivals. He missed the sense of purpose that came from steering an empire. In exile he was a relic, a respected relic, but a relic nonetheless. Frustration simmered beneath his calm exterior. He tried guiding operations from afar, but time and distance distorted everything. Instructions were misinterpreted. Plans delayed. Loyalty thinned. He no longer moved the world with whispers. His voice now reached only fragments of the empire. The quiet realization: empires do not belong to their founders forever. Luciano had always believed he was designing a system that would prevent future chaos. And he succeeded. The commission stabilized the Mafia for decades. But exile forced him to confront a darker truth. A system built to outlive its creator does exactly that. It outlives its creator. This was his triumph, and his heartbreak. He had created a mafia no longer dependent on kings or tyrants. But that meant it no longer depended on him. The structure he built continued to grow as he shrank from the center of it. Gradually he accepted that legacy is not control. Legacy is the echo of control, not the continuation of it. The last threads of the web. Luciano's final years were spent in the ambiguity of half-power. He was respected but not obeyed. Consulted but not essential. Feared in name but not in presence. He lived off old legends and fading loyalties. Yet even then, his fingerprints lingered across continents. In drug routes he helped design, in political friendships he once forged, in the commission that still met under rules he wrote. He could not command anymore, but he could still influence. He could not return to America, but his ideas had taken root there permanently. He could not rebuild the empire, but he remained its first architect. A man watching his own shadow fade as Luciano aged, walking slower along Neapolitan streets, he carried a quiet realization: power is temporary. Architecture is eternal. He had lost the former, but he had built the latter. He died in 1962 with a cigarette in his hand and the last thread of his web still faintly vibrating. The empire no longer belonged to him, but it existed because of him. In the end, Luciano did not fade into obscurity. He faded into legacy. Long after Lucky Luciano died in 1962, the world kept speaking his name, not as a ghost, not as a cautionary tale, but as the blueprint of modern organized crime. His fingerprints stretch across continents, buried beneath layers of syndicates, alliances, governing councils, and silent rules followed religiously by criminals who never met him and in some cases barely know who he was. It is the paradox of his legacy. A man whose power evaporated in exile, yet whose architecture still silently runs the dark economies of nations. Luciano didn't just influence the Mafia. He shaped the idea of organized crime itself. The Commission's echo across continents. The Commission, Luciano's greatest innovation, outlived him by generations. It became the backbone of the five families in New York, the model for the Chicago outfit's governing structure, the template for the Sicilian Mafia's cupola, the early influence behind the 'Ndrangheta's decentralized clans, and the conceptual ancestor of Mexican and Colombian cartel councils. Where old criminal groups operated like monarchies, Luciano offered a parliament. Where gangs solved conflict through bloodshed, he offered negotiation. Where leaders demanded obedience through fear, he enforced structure through stability. No one before him had created a bureaucracy of crime, a system where power was distributed so that no single death could unravel the whole. That system survives today. Essentially, Luciano made crime scalable. The globalization of criminal enterprise. Luciano's organizational philosophy, decentralized leadership with centralized profit strategy, laid the foundation for globalized criminal operations. You can see traces of his blueprint in drug cartels, which run cross-border supply chains as efficiently as multinational corporations, human trafficking syndicates, which rely on layered cells rather than singular bosses, international money laundering networks, which operate through financial hubs far beyond traditional underworld turf cybercrime rings, which mimic the same modular hierarchy. Luciano pioneered the underworld, learned that fragmentation is not weakness, it is insurance. A hierarchy that cannot be decapitated is almost impossible to dismantle. Luciano understood this decades before any criminologist put it into theory. Myth versus reality, how much was genius? How much was luck? Luciano's legend towers over his reality, and separating the two requires honesty. The genius, he possessed a rare strategic intelligence. He saw patterns where others saw chaos. He understood human psychology intuitively. He grasped that influence is more efficient than intimidation, that alliances outperform vendettas, and that systems outlive personalities. He redesigned the Mafia's internal logic, and no one before him had even attempted such a transformation. This part of his legacy is real, earned, and indisputable. The luck. His rise overlapped with massive forces beyond any one man's control. Prohibition created unprecedented profits. Political corruption in New York opened pathways for bribery and influence. Old world bosses were aging, arrogant, and divided. The Castellamarese War created a leadership vacuum only a strategist could fill. Luciano was brilliant, yes, but he was also in the right place at the right time with the right allies and facing the right enemies. History rarely crowns a king without chaos clearing the way. The myth, the underworld loves heroes and villains. The press loves symbols. And both turned Luciano into something larger than life. He became the father of the modern mafia, the mastermind behind every major racket, the puppeteer of New York's corruption, the shadow king of organized crime. Some of this was exaggerated by prosecutors like Dewey, who needed a figurehead to attack. Some was embellished by gangsters who wanted to glorify the organization. And some of it became legend simply because legends are easier to remember than structures. In truth, Luciano didn't control everything. He controlled enough, and designed the rest. His myth filled the gaps his real power never touched. The psychological blueprint, influence beyond death. Luciano's legacy isn't just structural. It is psychological. He introduced concepts that became cultural expectations inside organized crime. Negotiation before violence, profit before ego, alliances across ethnic divides, delegated power as a survival tool, silence as strategic leverage. His underworld wasn't ruled by bravado. It was ruled by calm, calculation, and confidence. Even mobsters today, in New York, Italy, Canada, and Latin America, still quote principles that trace back to Luciano's era. Never let one man have too much power. Violence is the last option, not the first. Always keep your hands off the dirty work. Respect the structure, it exists to protect you. He didn't leave behind commandments. He left behind instincts. Instincts that continue to shape the behavior of criminals who never heard his voice. The irony of his legacy, a system that didn't need him. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of Luciano's legacy is this. He built a system strong enough to survive without him, and it did. By the time he was exiled to Italy, the commission functioned independently. Profits flowed without his oversight. Disputes were resolved without his mediation. The empire he imagined had become self-policing, self-correcting, self-sustaining. This was both triumph and tragedy. He created the modern mafia. But the modern mafia no longer needed its creator. Luciano was the architect, not the owner. And architects rarely live inside the buildings they design. Why his influence still endures? Luciano's ideas endure because they mirror truths about human behavior and power. Systems outlive leaders, cooperation outperforms domination, structure transforms chaos into stability, invisible influence is stronger than brute force. These are not criminal principles. These are universal principles. And that is why his legacy survives not just in the mafia, but in every organized criminal system built across the last century. The final reflection. The man behind the myth. In the end, Luciano was neither fully genius nor fully myth. He was something in between. A man who understood the world so clearly that he learned to shape it quietly. He didn't invent organized crime. He invented organized crime. And though he died far from the streets he once ruled, the networks he built continue to echo around the world, in shadows, in systems, in secrets. His empire didn't disappear. It dispersed. His name didn't fade. It transformed. Lucky Luciano became what he always sought to be, not a king, but an architect whose designs outlasted the kingdom.